Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are the foundation of Western literature. For 2,500 years, painters, sculptors, poets, composers, and later theater and film directors have returned to these stories, and three episodes have fascinated artists more than most. Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops, traps Odyssey and his men in a cave and eats them one by one. The sirens drive sailors mad with their singing, while the sorceress Circe turns Odyssey's companions into pigs. Over the centuries, artists developed two main ways of depicting the Odyssey. Both work, and Nolan could have chosen either one and made a great film. Instead, he commits to neither, and that, in my opinion, is the movie's biggest problem. So today we will look at some of the best examples from classical art, compare them with Nolan's choices, and try to understand why his Odyssey turned into such a visual disaster. One clarification before we begin. I will not discuss the casting, the ideological controversies. I am only interested in the visual side. My name is Alexey Pashkov, by the way. I'm an art historian, and on this channel, I help viewers to get a better understanding of great art. I'm glad to see you here, and hope you will stick around. Okay, to the topic at hand. Polyphemus is probably the most famous monster in the Odyssey. But what should a Cyclops actually look like? Throughout art history, there have been two main answers. The first approach is classical or classicizing. It follows the principles of ancient Greek art, where beauty usually mattered more than realism. A hero remained beautiful even while fighting or dying or suffering. Interestingly, that beauty often extended to the hero's enemies. And one of the earliest examples can be found at Sperlonga, which is a small Italian town between Rome and Naples. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Emperor Tiberius owned a villa there beside a huge natural grotto. The cave was filled with the life-size sculptural groups based on the Odyssey, and those were not flat reliefs or statues lined up against the wall. No, guests could actually walk among the figures and almost step inside Homer's poem. So it was basically an ancient immersive attraction. Most of the sculptures survive only in fragments, but scholars have partly reconstructed two major compositions. One showed Scylla attacking Odysseus' ship. The second showed the blinding of Polyphemus. Odysseus and his men drive a huge sharpened stake into the sleeping Cyclops' eye. Polyphemus is enormous, but he does not look like a hideous monster. He has an ideal athletic body, almost as beautiful as the man attacking him. The main difference is sheer size. He is less a monster than a gigantic ancient athlete. That is how the classicizing tradition works, and the same approach continued in European painting later. Take Jacob Jordan's, for example. He shows Odysseus and his men escaping from the cave. To fool the blinded Polyphemus, they hide beneath his ramps. The Cyclops feels the animals' backs as they leave, but fails to notice the men clinging underneath. Jordan follows Homer's text quite closely. His Polyphemus is huge, but anatomically believable. Since this is the Baroque period, his body is less idealized, with a heavy torso and a visible belly, but he is still basically human, just extremely large. We see something similar in Jean-Léon Gérôme's 19th century painting. Its main theme is the romance of travel. Green water, white cliffs, Greek sunlight, and a tiny ship sailing away. Polyphemus towers over the landscape, but his body remains harmonious and human. Paintings like this can be technically perfect, but there is a problem. They are not scary. For the artists who created them, the Odyssey was a beautiful classical fairy tale. They did not believe in Cyclops, so they turned a nightmare into an elegant spectacle. But in the 19th century, another approach appeared. Some artists began asking a different question. What would Polyphemus look like to someone who truly believed monsters might exist? Just imagine an ancient sailor leaving familiar shores. For that sailor, a man-eating giant is not just a literal fantasy. It's one of the possible horrors of the unknown world. So romantic and symbolist artists began bringing that primitive cruelty of the myth back. A good example would be an artist from Brussels, Anthony Wirtz. His Polyphemus looks nothing like a beautiful athlete. He bites into a living man's leg as bodies twist around him, fire erupts, and people struggle to escape. But the best example, in my opinion, comes from the Swiss symbolist Arnold Böcklin. In Böcklin's painting, Odysseus and his companions have reached their ship and are trying to escape. The blinded Polyphemus hears Odysseus' voice and throws a huge rock into the sea. But the Cyclops is only part of the effect. Look at the shoreline. It's empty, rocky, and completely wild. This is the edge of the known world. Polyphemus seems to belong to the landscape itself. His face is barely visible, his hair is tangled, and his whole posture expresses animal rage. He only vaguely resembles a human being, and the sailors are not posing or showing off heroic bodies, they are rowing for their lives. Personally, I find this Polyphemus much more convincing than the beautiful giant of classical art. But ultimately, both approaches work. And what does Nolan do? He never fully chooses either option. His Polyphemus clearly does not belong to the classical tradition. His body is heavy and saggy and dirty, with none of the beauty of ancient sculpture. But he is not truly frightening either. To show the monster through the eyes of an ancient sailor, Nolan needed to go much further. Polyphemus could have been more grotesque. The scene could have captured the claustrophobia of the cave and the horror of watching man torn apart. Instead, we get a large, slow, and awkward doll. And an artistic decision that refuses to choose is often the weakest decision of all. Now, let us move to the sirens. But first, I wanted to ask you for a favor real quick. If you like where this video is going so far, would you hit the subscribe button for me? That really helps me with the channel and also makes sure that YouTube will send my next video straight into your feed. Okay, the sirens. In the poem, Circe warns Odyssey about creatures whose song no man can hear without losing his mind. Odyssey wants to hear them, so he tells his companions to block their ears with wax and tie him to the mast. As the ship approaches the island, the sirens begin to sing, Odyssey begs to be released, but the crew only tightens the ropes. On the famous ancient vase showing Odysseus, the sirens have women's heads and birds' bodies. They circle the ship while Odyssey listens, tied to the mast, and similar creatures appear on Greek funerary monuments quite often. But this creates a problem. You see, Homer himself gives almost no description of their appearance. He tells us about their voices, their song, and the danger they represent, but he says nothing about wings or claws or birds' bodies. A detailed literary description appears much later, for example in the Orgonautica, which is a poem by Apollonius from Rhodes, but that was written centuries after Homer. So, a director adapting the Odyssey does not have to show the sirens as birds. In that sense, Nolan's decision is completely defensible. In his movie, a ship approaches an island hidden in fog. Blurred female figures appear through the mist without wings or birds' legs or monstrous features. That is not automatically a mistake. Actually, the tradition of showing sirens as beautiful women is also very old. Even ancient writers try to explain myth rationally. One of the best-known examples is Palafetas, an ancient Greek writer who created a treatise called On Unbelievable Tales. And his basic idea was simple. If a myth describes something impossible, perhaps a real event was distorted over time. For example, centaurs. Those may have started as stories about people seeing skilled horsemen from a distance and mistaking a rider and horse for one creature. The sirens received a similar explanation. There is a late ancient text attributed to Heraclitus, not the philosopher, just a person with a similar name, and he suggests that sirens were originally beautiful courtesans or beautiful heteras living near the sea. They sang, played music, and thus attracted sailors. The sailors spent all their money on them and, in a metaphorical sense, suffered shipwreck. And once the money was gone, the women moved on to the new clients. According to the author, this explains the later idea that they could suddenly fly away on wings. It was a metaphor. During the Middle Ages and especially the early modern period, sirens gradually merged with the mermaids and sea nymphs. And by the 18th and 19th centuries, the subject had become very useful for European artists. You see, classical academic art followed strict rules of propriety. Painting of an ordinary naked woman could cause a scandal. But if the very same naked woman was titled an Aphrodite or a nymph or a siren, well, that was acceptable. So the artist could create an erotic image and still present it as a serious classical art. Edward Artimage, for example, shows a beautiful naked siren holding a musical instrument and waiting on a rock for a ship. In Henrietta Rere's painting, 3 sirens rest on the shore. The wreckage of an earlier ship lies nearby, while the sail of the next victim appears in the distance. Elsewhere, sirens look like sea nymphs, with their musical nature indicated by a lyre, a harp, or a tambourine. In paintings by François Girard and Herbert Draper, they surround Odyssey's ship and reach toward the sailors. The purpose of many of these works is fairly obvious. They let viewers admire naked female bodies while feeling connected to the grandeur of classical culture. But this polished, so to speak, tradition eventually produced a reaction. Some artists tried to turn the sirens back into monsters. In paintings by Franz von Stuck and other symbolists, they become predatory and disturbing. And as always, Böcklin's sirens are especially strange. They have female heads and torsos, but also clawed birds' legs, crude tails, and deliberately unattractive faces. He seems determined to destroy the familiar erotic image. There are not beautiful women who happen to have wings. They are real hybrids, monstrous, creatures from another world. Now let us return to Nolan. He chooses to show the sirens as beautiful women, and that is a perfectly valid decision. It does not contradict Homer and has a long artistic tradition behind it. The problem is that Nolan once again refuses to take the idea far enough. If you choose an erotic approach, I, as a viewer, want to get my money's worth. I want to see the deadly seducing beauty of sirens, and I mean I want to see all of it. And once again, the film chooses the direction, takes one step, and stops. The sirens remain hidden behind the fog. I am disappointed. Finally, the third episode involves Circe. In the poem, Odysseus' companions enter her palace. She gives them food and wine, then turns them into pigs. But the text includes an important detail. Lions and wolves live around her house also. And they do not attack anyone. They behave almost like domestic animals. This suggests a disturbing possibility. Perhaps they were also once human, early travelers transformed by Circe also. For artists, this episode offered several different approaches. The first was comic or pastoral. I mean, pigs can look charming, so Circe sometimes resembles a young shepherdess or swineherd. That is what happens in a painting by British artist Breton Riviere. At first it looks like a normal rural scene with a young woman standing beside a herd of pigs. Only later do we notice the magic wand and classical architecture. Then we understand that the pigs are Odysseus' companions. The painting becomes a visual puzzle for an educated viewer. The second approach focuses on the animals themselves. For an animal painter, Circe's story was a perfect excuse to place many different species on one canvas. Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione, for example, shows Circe surrounded by animals that were humans only moments before. Empty pieces of armor attest to it, and we see birds, rabbits, horses, and other creatures. The artist gets to display his range, while the myth provides a reason for the strange catalog of animals. By the late 19th century, however, Circe has changed. That was the age of decadence and the fin de siècle, when European art became fascinated by forbidden desires, mysticism, and dangerous female sexuality. One of the period's central figures was the femme fatale, a seductive woman who controls men through beauty and eventually destroys them. Circe was perfect for the role. In a painting by Wright Barker, she stands among beasts that were once men. A lion, a fox, and other predators lie at her feet, completely under her control. In John Collier's painting, Circe plays with tigers and other wild animals as if they were house cats. Her power comes not only from magic, but also from sexual attraction. The most radical version appears in a painting by the French symbolist Louis Chalon. His Circe is no longer simply a woman or even a sorceress. She looks like a goddess or a priestess of some mysterious Eastern cult. She sits on an enormous throne surrounded by mystical symbols, while fat pigs crawl over one another at her feet. The meaning is quite direct. Man belongs to the lower animal world, while woman has access to high mysteries and cosmic forces. And finally, there is another, far more visually exciting approach. The transformation of a person into an animal can be treated as horror. For example, in a painting by an unknown Italian artist, Odysseus' companions are caught in the middle of their transformation. They are no longer fully human, but they have not yet become animals. That intermediate state creates the strongest effect. In a work by Bartolomeo Passerotti, the men's faces are distorted, with human and animal features existing at the same time. This is almost an early form of body horror. And we might also think of, for example, adaptations of the Island of Dr. Moreau, where humans and animals are fused into unnatural hybrids. That is why the Circe episode gave Nolan so many possibilities. Here, at least, he chooses a potentially powerful direction. The transformation of Odysseus' companions becomes a brief body horror sequence. Circe physically kneads and stretches and reshapes their bodies. The idea itself is excellent, but once again, the execution is too cautious. Real body horror should make us physically uncomfortable. We should almost feel bones breaking and joints shifting and human features disappearing. You have to commit as a director. And once again, Nolan takes only half a step. To sum up, Nolan rejects the artistic traditions that shaped earlier visions of the Odyssey, but fails to create a convincing visual language of his own. That, to me, is the film's main problem. It's not the historical inaccuracies. It is the simple fact that the movie feels bland and boring. And what do you think? I would love to read your thoughts in the comments.